starting today's. A very good evening to one and all. Now we are to start today's session. So myself Anukriti Raj, the moderator of the series Azadi ka Amrit Mahotsav, organized by Expressions in Languages and Arts Foundation, Lucknow, Uttar Pradesh. On behalf of the foundation, I take this opportunity to extend my heartiest greetings to the speaker this evening, Dr. Shubham Singh, and to all my dear friends and participants who have joined us. Special thanks, my special thanks to Professor Head, Dr. Asha Ram sir. I could see him every day. Sir is with us and he's joining, and listening to us. सर आपका यूँ इस तरह निरंतर हमारे साथ जुड़ना हमारा मनोबल बढ़ाता है और ऐसे काम करने से हमें प्रेरित करता है कि हम ऐसा काम आगे भी करते रहें। सर आपका जुड़ना आप किसी आशीर्वाद से कम नहीं, आपका जुड़ना हमारे साथ यूँ ही। धन्यवाद सर, धन्यवाद प्रोफेसर। And many other professors I could see, so I would like to thank all the professors and participants. आपका आपके समक्ष मैं फाउंडेशन का कुल गीत प्रस्तुत करती हूँ। So
सत्य सृजन है नश्वर जग में।
सो जैसा कि आप भली भांति परिचित हो चुके हैं कि हमारे इस श्रृंखला भाषा साहित्य और समाज काव्य पाठ चर्चा एवं संवाद से इसी हमारा मकसद क्या है इस प्रोग्राम के पीछे, जो कि आप जानते हैं कि हम यह आज़ादी का सफ़र एक्सप्रेशंस इन लैंग्वेजेस एंड आर्ट्स फाउंडेशन लखनऊ के संग हम मना रहे हैं. सो टू इन ऑर्डर टू सेलिब्रेट द अमृत महोत्सव एंड हेड टूवर्ड्स बिल्डिंग द आत्मनिर्भर भारत of our dreams. So we all are there to draw the inspiration from the words of several freedom fighters, spiritual gurus, administrators, and various unsung heroes, without whose sacrifice and commitment for the country we would have never thought of achieving the independence. सो समय का ध्यान रखते हुए मैं आगे आज के मुख्य वक्ता डॉक्टर शुभम सिंह जी का फाउंडेशन एक्सप्रेशंस इन लैंग्वेजेस एंड आर्ट्स फाउंडेशन की तरफ से मैं हार्दिक अभिनंदन और स्वागत करती हूँ. एंड सो बिफोर नाउ आई टेक दिस प्रिविलेज to introduce Dr. Shubham Singh before our audience. So Dr. Shubham Singh works as an assistant professor of English at the Department of English, Deen Dayal Upadhyay, Gorakhpur University. His doctoral research is rooted in the contemporary American drama and theatre. He was, he has interest in trauma studies, gender, sexuality studies, and postmodern literature. Dr. Singh has been a resource person in several national and international conferences, seminars, and workshops. So, today, before us, Dr. Singh would be sharing his views, on the topic regional literature and national consciousness in relation to, the Indian freedom struggle. So, before taking time, I request now Dr. Singh to please proceed.
Thank you so much. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are. Please.
Okay, thank you. Before I move on with my talk, I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Alka Singh for giving me this opportunity to speak on such an interesting topic today. And I also welcome all the listeners who are present here today. As you have already been informed, the topic of my talk is regional literature, national consciousness, and Indian freedom struggles. So what basically I'm trying to come up with in this talk is how regional literatures written in different Indian languages inspired a sense of national consciousness among the general people, among the common people, not discussing iconic works, but works which were sort of foundation stones for the generation of national consciousness, an idea of an independent country, independent India, and how it went on to declare its own independence in the years to come. So regional literature played a significant role in the struggle for India's freedom, and the awakening of a sense of national consciousness was also ushered by it. In the 19th century, as the nationalist ideas began to emerge and literature in various regional Indian languages was being propelled in the modern phase, writers began to use literature for patriotic purposes, for awakening the sentiments of the people. And the realization of the this subjection, this slavery at the hands of the British, and the need for freedom had begun to be expressed in literature even before the organization of any major political movements or agitations. So this talk serves to provide a brief overview of how regional literature in languages like Bengali, Gujarati, Hindi, even Marathi strengthened the growing optimism of the people, and how it dealt with the shortcomings of the nationalist movement and its leaders, like the sin of pride or something like that. So literature of the last 30 years of the freedom struggle again tells us that during this crucial period, people were increasingly becoming aware of the socio-economic situation of the country, and they were also motivated by a zeal of independence. So now moving forward, I'll first take a look at Bengali literature and how it in its essence ushered the idea of a national consciousness. So when we talk of Bengali literature and its contribution to the freedom movement, the name of Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay stands out, though there were several other writers such as Ramesh Chandra and R.C. Dutt who wrote novels of greatly patriotic themes. But Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay was someone who's really credited with starting or beginning that trend from where this idea of national consciousness emerges. So from the mid-19th century, novels and fiction, especially historical and social, were gaining popularity in Bengal. Nationalism was perhaps the single greatest inspiration behind the historical novels in Bengal, and there were ideas about the glories and the heroism of the past, but it was also about the similar achievements for the future and how we could start a whole movement for India's freedom struggle. Now, we all know that Rabindranath Tagore's concept of freedom was largely analogous with what he termed as the liberation of conscience. So this is what this comes down to. This is where it started. Bankim Chand wrote essays that compelled the readers to think about the causes of the existing wretched state of their country. His novels were intended to inspire the ordinary countrymen with patriotic sentiments. He even brought out journals such as the Bangadarshan with a view to educating and inspiring the common people. And though he wrote social novels also, it was largely through his historical romances that he broadcasted his message of patriotism. He combined history and fancy to create characters who were only too willing to make any sacrifice, even lay down their lives in the fight against injustice, oppression, and subjection. So this combination became particularly effective in one of his famous works, which is known as Anand Mat, which with its celebrated song Vande Mataram, the Anand Mat inspired generations of patriots, and the revolutionaries made it their anthem, their gospel for the freedom struggle. So there is reported, however, a pro-Hindu bias also in his works and his conception of nationalism in general. This is even assumed to be having an anti-Muslim feeling, as in Anand Mat, the fight was against the Muslim oppressors. But he was very cautious, he's very careful about that bias, as it is reflected in a cross-section of nationalists. And although this bias was not part of the dominant ideology of Indian nationalism that emerged during the later years of the 19th century, it is still visible in the literature of the period. And then we move on to the next Bengali writer of the 19th century, R.C. Dutt, who is also remembered as one of the pioneers of what we know as economic nationalism, for his powerful exposure of the country's exploitation under the British rule, its economic downfall, its wealth being drifted or drained away to the British lands. So despite his westernization, Dutt remained a Hindu. Again, he was also a Hindu at heart who admired and respected his traditions and culture. And it is this aspect of his personality that led him to write works such as the Economic History of India, or the history of the civilization in ancient India, and the translations of Rig Veda, Ramayana, and Mahabharata, all that indicate his, again, pro-Hindu stance. In his own lifetime and a little later also, his novels and economic writings inspired people in Bengal and in other parts of the country. But again, he was conscious of this charge, he was conscious of this anti-Muslim stance, and so he realized that this could lead to a kind of breakdown in the national unity, in their attempts towards national integration. And so his later works reveal this consciousness, reveal this attempt at again integrating the Indian society. So Indian nationalism, like nationalism in other parts of the world, was a comprehensive force that appealed to the people more than on one plane. It appealed to their idealism, it appealed to their optimism, it appealed to their material interests as well. So in his social novel, which is known as Samaj, the title is Samaj, he self-consciously revealed a conception of Indian nationalism in which Hindus were seen as the key figures. But then again, it is not to say that he was a communalist. His example highlights that Indian nationalism contains the undertones of which were capable of emerging as having communal tendencies, but his timely realization of the drawbacks of such an approach led him to modify his stance. And again, he produced a literature that became a very viable medium for change. And coming to Gujarati literature, Govardhan Tripathi, again, is one of the makers of modern Gujarati literature, and he wrote several parts of his famous novel Saraswati Chandra, which was designed as an epic in prose and written to inspire and educate the reading classes of Gujarat about the destiny of their countries. Now, again, the educated classes is what he talks about in this novel Saraswati Chandra, and it deals with the multifaceted problems of India in bondage and lays down possible lines of uh, reflection and action for patriotically inclined Indians. And it laments the loss of India's independence. At the same time, however, it welcomes the fact that of all the nations, it is the British who were ruling the country, because again, they had their sense of justice, their sense of their love for democracy, they prepare India for sort of self-rule, and that is why he even sees this as a fortunate incident. Then this faith was an essential part of the Indian attitude towards the colonial connection. This is why early Indian nationalists welcomed the British rule, even though they were aware of its exploitative dimensions. So there was a dual attitude towards the British rule in the late 19th century Indian literature. Writers such as Vishnu Chiplankar comment on how British rule had affected the English and English speaking Indians. Crushed by English poetry, our freedom has been destroyed, he says. So it implies English education in general, basically not just poetry. English education was promoted for the welfare of the Indians. And again, it was promoted as the English rule, or the British rule was promoted as a sort of divine dispensation for the Indian people. Moving on to Hindi literature, Bhartendu Harishchandra, we are all familiar with the name, he was largely instrumental in bringing the modern phase of Hindi literature. He wrote in a variety of forms such as drama, poetry, essay, and he even enlightened the people through his journals about the affairs of the country and the contemporary society. A large portion of Bhartendu's writings is concerned with the question of subjection, of slavery, of British dominance. For example, in a public lecture on the promotion of Hindi, he asks the people, how come as human beings we became slaves and they, the British, the kings? He went on in this lecture to warn against the paralyzing tendency of depending on the foreigners for the country's salvation. It's okay to depend to a certain extent to reap whatever is good from their own ideas of justice and liberation and democracy and all. But to continually depend on the British rule would not be good for India as a nation, or the idealization of the national consciousness. So that is why he promotes that idea in his works. He spurred the people on to set aside their fear and mutual differences and to stand up to uphold the dignity of their language, their individual languages, their religion, their cultures, and the country by and large. So as it was delivered in the form of couplets, to people, the during the Prabhat fairies. So again, people were attracted to them. One advantage of such compositions was that the reality of foreign rule could be brought out in an idiom that even illiterate or fairly limited educated millions could identify and grasp and feel inspired by. So that was what was required, and that is what these writers were doing. Then he made the concept of drain of wealth understandable to the common people in their own language. People here have been fooled by the power and trickeries of the machine. He says every day they are losing their wealth and their distress is increasing. Still, they are unable to do without foreign clothes. They have become the slaves of foreign weavers. They have grown so accustomed to the British rule. And he uses the simple term foreign weavers to denote the powerful industrial interests of Manchester and relates the deeper forces of imperialism with life around common men and women in India that is still under slavery. So he did so in a conventional poetic form known as Mukari that contained 4 lines, and he used popular forms in his plays too. So many plays are renowned for his, again, speaking in such an idiom such as Andher Nagri Chaupat Raja, which is very popular, in which humor is effectively utilized for political ends. Then in his Bharat Durdasha, which is his most directly political play, he introduced many funny sequences or sentences. And in the same work, he also accepts the duality of British rule, due to which a regeneration of the country had been facilitated. So even though it was an evil, it was a sort of necessary evil, because it reorganized the Indian society. And in Bharat Janani, another of his political plays, he admits that if the British had not come to administer India, the country's ruin would have gone on uninterrupted. So these ideas are also continually promoted. This duality keeps on resurfacing again and again. And this duality of attitude towards the British connection is not peculiar to these writers or these languages alone. They are meant to indicate the general pattern of the educated Indian response to the West in general and the British rule in particular. So with the passage of time, the realization of this subjection and its disastrous consequences tended to become dominant, and the appreciation of the boons offered by the British began to decline. And slowly, the other aspect of the freedom struggle became more predominant, and people began to resonate with that. By the end of the 19th century and the coming of the 20th century, freedom was seen as a natural condition with the again happening of the two world wars. Freedom was seen as something which is naturally aligned with the concept of humanity, of humanism, and it is something that is desirable and people should aspire to it. So India could be no exception to this rule, and instead of specific grievances and specific concessions, an integrated critique of British rule evolved over the years, and freedom seemed to be the only solution. With this, freedom would mean what this freedom would mean actually in concrete terms, however, was not the dominant theme, and how the country would govern itself, what sort of systems would be followed to ensure justice and equality and fraternity for all were not really the dominant theme in those days. Basically, the freedom at all costs became predominant, and that is how the bifurcation in the Indian society, in the Indian social fabric, never made the center stage. So it is not that issues like poverty and exploitation within the Indian society, as against the exploitation by the British, did not figure in Indian literature before the world wars. They often did, and such as one particular work, Six Bighas of Land, a novel by Fakir Mohan Senapati, who is one of the makers of modern Oriya literature. It shows the plight of peasants, much like Munshi Premchand, whom I would be coming to later on. So Radhacharan Goswami, another renowned Hindi writer, was moved by this rural poverty to suggest that the land does not belong to or should not belong to the government or even to the zamindar. This is a very popular comment. We all must be knowing about this. It should basically belong to the peasant who tilled it. And this zeal only remained sentimental, though. It was only in the works of literature that we could find such a sentiment. It could not lead to a social reorganization, and nor was it integrated with the question of national freedom. So as stated earlier, literature of the last 30 years of the freedom struggle tells us that during this crucial period, people were increasingly becoming aware of socioeconomic issues. They were realizing their positions in the world at large. They were realizing how they have been cheated and fooled in the name of civilizing them. And even as they were motivated by the zeal for independence, they realized their status in the world at large, in the contemporary society. So it consequently turned more and more to the ideological dimension of the freedom struggle. The work of Munshi Premchand, again, very consequential. It illustrates the anxiety about this disturbing side of nationalist struggle. In his two major novels, Rangbhumi and Karmabhumi, he brings out the underlying selfishness of the educated nationalist leaders. But it is carefully disguised with a humanism and radicalism. So there are foibles, there are weaknesses in every person, in every even people we seem to eulogize. But the most depressing view of nationalist politics it does not have a redeeming feature like the earlier novels. It does not have the positive impact or a positive view of the future. It clearly shows the role of money and the petty material considerations in national politics, how they define everything in society. So the Rai Sahab, a rich Jamidar, joins the Satyagraha and then goes back to the politics of the Legislative Council and unscrupulously uses money in the bargain. Similarly, there's a character named Anna who is a banker, businessman, and petty industrialist who's all rolled into one and does his bit during the civil disobedience movement. Then again, there is another character known as Omkar Nath, who is a journalist who can breathe fire in his editorials, but again, basically, he's a self-seeker for whom nationalism is a matter of self-promotion. So exploitation being its basic theme, Godan portrays a sad and cheerless world. Here, Premchand is not carried away by sentimentalism. He does not offer any easy solutions. Godan does not suddenly undergo a change of heart. No character does that um, in this particular book. But in fact, there are, okay, I'll wind up in short while. In fact, there are no villains in this novel. It is not the wickedness of individuals that leads them to oppose or exploit their poor fellow human beings. Exploitation is the result of certain socio-economic and political arrangements within the society. That is what this novel seems to hint. The oppressed classes will not have a better deal if those belonging to the dominant classes are individually good and kind persons. There are kind people like Rai Sahab himself is a kind-hearted zamidar, but he has understood this when he says in one of the most famous lines that I cannot set aside my self-interest. Yet I want that my class should be forced to give up its selfishness through the pressure of the administration and morality. So both are necessary. What naturally he does not see is the real solution is not bringing pressure upon the one particular class or one particular set of people, the zamindars, but to abolish the class system and even the kisani system and all that. Again, the whole logic points towards this solution. So basically, this is what this work does. It brings out all its intricacy, the duality of class and nation. Freedom of the nation is essential, but it should not be the freedom of the dominant classes. That is what Godan points out. And it should not be the freedom to exploit the wretched of the society. One set of rulers should not be replaced by Indian rulers or Indian set of rulers. Nationalism should not be permitted to disguise in the name of patriotic idealism, and the interests of the few at the expense of the many should not continue. So if Premchand, like most of his contemporaries, reveals both a Gandhian and socialist influence, and if he paints a dismal picture of the national movement and also provides a stirring account of the same movement, the task of the historian today, the people who read about the national consciousness and its framing in the current time, is not to assume that only one of these conflicting positions can be the real positions. There are complexes, there are complex conflicts there, and they should be addressed. Instead, historians should see the conflicting positions forming a part of a complex whole. And of course, they should see this in the unresolved ideological conflicts working in the socio-economic forces, socio-economic arena as well. So as is clear from this description, in all his novels, in Karma Bhumi, in Rang Bhumi, and even in Godan and others, contemporary literature by Premchand and others provides the historians with insights for seeing the dialectical operation of ideology and material interests. And these work together, form a sort of national consciousness within the separate regions in which they are written, in the languages in which they are written, so that the idea of India as a country, because people until then were living as a whole that had not been defined as an identity that had not been defined in terms of its contrast with the foreign rulers. So this goes on to develop the idea of national consciousness, and this goes on to develop what we know now as the zeal, which made India really move on the path towards its independence. So this is basically what I wish to sum up with in this particular talk. As time is, I think it's almost over. So thank you for letting me speak on this topic. I can
Participants, okay. So, yes. Thank you,
thank you.
Dr. Thank you, Dr. Shubham. It was really, very insightful, and how.
Thank
So what I could recollect, I would just, I would like to summarize, and the key takeaway for the participant, I would just like to, share
thank
my what I could relate. So literature, as you said, no, literature played a very significant role in the struggle of India's freedom and the sense of us, awakening a sense of national consciousness. In the 19th century, as you told, that how the nationalistic ideas began to emerge, and literature in various regional languages of India entered the modern phase. Writers begin to, use literature for patriotic purposes. So the realization of the subjection at the hand of British, and the need for freedom, and had begun to express in literature even before the organization of any major political agitations or movements. Your talk served to provide a brief overview of how regional literature in languages like Bengali, Gujarati, and Hindi strengthened the growing optimism of people, and how it dealt with the shortcomings of nationalistic movement and its leaders. So literature of the last 30 years of the freedom, as I could sense from your talk, that freedom struggle, that tells us that during this crucial period, people were increasingly becoming aware of the socio-economic issues, even, as they were motivated by the zeal of independence. So thank you once again, डॉक्टर शुभम, मैं आपका दिल से आभार और अभिनंदन व्यक्त करती हूँ
thank
फाउंडेशन
you.
की तरफ से, और मैं सभी पार्टिसिपेंट्स का आभार व्यक्त करती हूँ, और इस सेशन को हम क्लोज़ करते हैं, और कल हम दोबारा 6:30 बजे एक दूसरे टॉक के लिए मिलेंगे. सो तब तक के लिए आपका आभार और अभिनंदन, और ऐसे ही हमारे साथ आप जुड़िएगा कल भी. तो आपके
Thank
लिए अंत में मैं फाउंडेशन की तरफ से आभार गीत में प्रस्तुत करती हूँ. थैंक यू.